Hello and welcome to this recorded session on race equity foundations and resisting anti-indigeneity. My name is Ada Shen Jaffe. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently lead coach for Just Lead Washington. Before we begin, and to ground us in an anti-racism perspective, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all occupying land that was violently stolen from people indigenous to what is known now as Washington State and the United States. I sit in Seattle, which is within the traditional and ancestral territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish tribe. Dozens of other tribes, federally recognized or not, have inhabited and stewarded this land in our region for centuries. I say this not just to acknowledge a history and truth that is often overlooked, but also to invite us to reflect on the legacies of violence, colonialism, migration, and settlement that bring us together today, and to consider the ongoing contributions of and experiences faced by Indigenous communities. This practice also helps remind me and our organizations of the work that is necessary to be in right and accountable relationship with Indigenous communities. For example, at Just Lead, we pay rent to the Duwamish people through their Real Rent campaign. Can you do something in your area to make reparation or land return work? What are local tribes and Indigenous community members working on right now and asking of your organizations? I was also recently in a workshop where the beginning of the session had a land acknowledgement that was tied to a moment of silence, and then also included an invitation to reflect on and to honor other communities currently experiencing removal from their families, communities, and homelands, specifically naming incarcerated folks and folks being forcibly removed and detained by carceral forces like ICE. This was really powerful and grounding in the way we wove together the oppression that is faced by Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So for today's session, we have these goals. One is to introduce key concepts and foundational terms related to decolonization, race equity, structural racism, and implicit bias. Second, to understand the connections between settler colonialism, structural racism, and the role that the law and justice system specifically has played in perpetuating structural racism. And third, to understand the role that those of us committed to pro-equity and anti-racism work can play in undoing institutional racism. This is a sketch I did, I think in maybe June or July last summer, when what came to my mind was the double helix. You can see the two strands, red and blue. That is the drawing that represents how DNA is constructed in our lives, in our bodies. And so the image of the double helix came to me as I was trying to make sense of the coronavirus pandemic, and then what I saw as the post-George Floyd murder pandemic of virulent racism unleashed, as we saw in January of this year at the Capitol, and so many other events related to the unleashing of virulent racism. And the bands that connect the blue ribbon and the red ribbon of this DNA are opportunities, or the lack of opportunities, for who are Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, are access to decent housing, healthcare, educational opportunity, public safety, and so forth. And these are interconnected in ways that are intractable. And now I have heard for the last maybe week or so from mental health experts that we are seeing the burgeoning fourth pandemic, which is a pandemic of mental health related issues in proportions which are historic, which we have never seen before, that are endangering communities. They're endangering the systems, which are on overload, that are designed to try to help people who are struggling with mental health issues. After the George Floyd murder, Professor Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, wrote an article for The Atlantic magazine called The End of Denial. And what he was talking about is the way in which the George Floyd murder and the global anti-racist protests and movements that were ignited by the murder led to what he called the end of denial by white America, that racism is structural. So it could no longer be one bad police officer or one bad kid of color. There was an acknowledgement that this was structural in ways that pervade our civil system, our criminal justice system, juvenile justice, and our child welfare systems. And they're all intertwined multi-generationally in ways that amplify harm, especially to BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And they are allowed to do this because each of these systems in law and justice exists within a separate silo, as if it has no effect on the people in these other realms, when of course we know from terms such as the school to prison pipeline, or the criminalization of poverty, or the criminalization of people seeking immigration status, that these are all interconnected in ways that disproportionately harm communities of color. In June 4th of last year, our Washington Supreme Court issued a letter, and I have two pull quotes from that letter, post George Floyd murder. The first pull quote says, as judges, we can develop a greater awareness of our own conscious and unconscious biases in order to make just decisions in individual cases. And we can administer justice and support court rules in a way that brings greater racial justice to our system as a whole. I pulled this quote out to show that the court here is talking about each individual's responsibility to become more aware and educated and understanding about bias. In the second pull quote, which reads, we must also recognize that this is not how a justice system must operate. Too often in the legal profession, we feel bound by tradition and the way things have always been. We must remember that even the most venerable precedent must be struck down when it is incorrect and harmful. So in the second quote, the court is recognizing that as a system, not just solely at the individual personal level, but as an organization, as an institution, the justice system has an affirmative obligation to tackle racism. And so you see in that letter, they're looking at the individual level as well as the organizational level. When we're talking about racism, anti-racism work, and becoming pro-equity in an intentional way, as the court is asking us to do, as so many of our organizations have issued proclamations and statements about being anti-racist and doing everything possible to undo institutionalized racism. We like to get back to the why. What is the why of this work? And we borrow, with permission from Professor John Powell, who runs the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. He uses this term, everyone belongs within the circle of human concern. And our work is examining the forces that operate to exclude certain people from the circle and who is allowed in it, who is privileged to be in it, is defined by the status quo default power systems, and who gets excluded are those who people in power have the ability to throw out, and they do this through dehumanization, and they do this through devaluing or marginalizing certain groups of people. So at Just Lead, we define our why as we do this because we believe that everyone belongs and that no one should be othered. This slide has the Tower of Babel on the left, and that represents a situation where people are talking at each other but not really speaking the same language. And when that happens, it's very, very difficult to get anything done, and it's wasteful and frustrating. And so much of the work that we're doing today is making sure that we align and speak the same language. You do not have to agree with the definitions or terms as we are presenting them to you today. You can use your own, but make sure that your team, or if you have multi-organizational projects, that everybody on those project teams are speaking the same language. On the right side of this slide, you can see the picture of a symphony orchestra. And this represents our framework for doing the work together. So in a symphony orchestra, everybody is assigned a different instrument. We would not want to go hear a symphony that was played exclusively on tubas, for example. So some of us are playing in the string section, some brass, some woodwind, some percussion, and so forth. And yet we are all playing off of the same sheet of music. This is not free-form jazz that has each of us playing whatever we want, wherever we want. This is about collective action and solidarity of purpose. Many of you have seen this slide or something like it before. This is a definitional slide showing the difference between equality, which especially in law and justice is built in, baked in the parapet of the Supreme Court of the United States as equal justice under law. And the word equal and equality is the default term. However, equality does not get to the concepts of equity, which are about fundamental fairness, and also recognizing that everybody is not starting from the same ground. So you can see that on the left side, if everybody gets an equal box to stand on to watch something important to them, that really only one of them doesn't even really need the box. Another needs a box to see, and the third is left behind for a couple of reasons, mostly because the ground they're standing on is uneven. And historically, we know that the ground, especially BIPOC communities are standing on, has been multi-century, uneven, marginalized, and disparate in ways that disfavor those communities. And equity on the right side, and equity, which Professor John Powell talks about as targeted universalism, and you can find all these resources later. We'll show you on the last slide where you can look for them. So targeted universalism looks at where people are actually at, recognizes history and the realities today that certain communities face, and that their ground is not equal. If you think about Flint, Michigan, oh, I'm sorry, this slide just shows why can't we tear down the obstacles that keep certain communities from ever having access? I mean, no matter how much help we give them, there's still obstacles in front of them. So tearing those things down, dismantling those things so that barriers come down. And then on this one, I was beginning to reference Flint, Michigan. So you have a Flint, which has been still 4+ years later, facing lead in the water at levels that are poisonous, so that people have to drink and bathe and wash their dishes and cook with bottled water 4.5 years since the government altered the water delivery system in ways that dissolved lead from old pipes and put them into the Flint water supply system. And then you also have some of the richest communities in Michigan right nearby, and they have new water pipes, and their municipal services have been updated constantly while Flint has a downgrade. And so to fix that, there has to be more resources going to Flint, and not the same as to the very wealthy white communities that never had a problem with their water. So you can see on the right, you would give more resources to Flint, Flint being on the left of the slide. So equality means providing every person with the same resources, whereas equity means ensuring every person has the resources they need to produce outcomes and opportunities and build power. These are some basic definitions that we use. Again, you can use definitions that resonate with you in ways that are better from your perspective and the work that you do. However, just make sure you agree on what the terms are. Otherwise, you've got the Tower of Babel situation. So here we define diversity of people and perspectives as meaning there's representation of people of color in the workforce. That in and of itself is not sufficient. In many cases, as those who have gone to law school know, it's the same 5 kids of color who are on every brochure, even though there may be 150 to 250 students in the school. And so just having representation for optical purposes is not sufficient. It is a step, however, and then move on to inclusion, which is you're at the table and you also have a voice. So people of color as leaders and decision makers, in addition to ensuring representation. And then finally, equity on the right is about results and process. Are there policies and practices and procedures that create fairer outcomes where a race will no longer determine how one fares? A definition that we use of racial equity is when race no longer determines one's outcomes. Proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for everyone. So just take a moment to reflect. This is a slide I use for a different presentation for the Indian law section of the Washington State Bar. The question for you is the same. How does an intentional focus on anti-racism benefit your work as a member of the community that is working towards equity and anti-racism? So just take a moment and reflect on that. So if we were in person or online together live, I would have you unmute or chat and we could interact about this. But since this is recorded, just take those notes. And I think some of these reflections are really important as we build our competence in pro-equity work. The next slide talks about what structural racism is. So structural racism refers to the ways in which the joint or collective operation of all our institutions produce racialized outcomes. So, for example, in those circles, you can see the education system, employment, healthcare, transportation, childcare, and housing. So take another moment to reflect on what circles are missing. This is not comprehensive. So from your perspective in your work, what is missing from what circles would you add to the ones that are up there? 6 circles. So people will often add things like law enforcement, the criminal justice system, foster care, and dependency, and so forth. The other point of this slide is to reinforce the idea that structures are not neutral. These unevenly distribute benefits, burdens, disparity, and they reinforce dominant culture. So our dominant culture in America has a bias for white people. There is white privilege, and it biases people of color and Native people. It does this by marginalizing them, devaluing them, and the legacy of genocidal practices, of course, is literal marginalization of an entire group of people. So this shows you the 3 pillars of white supremacy, and those support heteropatriarchy. So if you look at the first pillar, it is chattel slavery. So that's embedded as what some call one of the original sins of American history. And slavery was about the forced and uncompensated labor of humans by dehumanizing them. So we know the Dred Scott decision, for example, declared that African Americans were not able to be citizens, that they were less than their white counterparts, and so forth. And that has, for centuries, upheld capitalism, a capitalistic system of the accumulation of wealth based on cheap labor or free labor in the case of chattel slavery. The second pillar is about genocide. So the genocide and the practices to dehumanize and devalue Native American or indigenous populations so that whites who are coming to settle on the land could claim the land as their own. By disappearing indigenous people, nobody then owned it, and then settlers who came in to colonize the United States could just take it and not feel like they were stealing anything. However, they were stealing, including native language, culture, and most tragically, their children, who were sent to assimilation schools where they often were abused. And as we're having tragic daily news of the uncovering of mass graves of children who are indigenous, you can see that genocide and its toxic, harmful effects are reverberating to the pages of today's news. And genocide upholds or validates colonialism by Anglo-white dominant cultures and people. The third pillar is Orientalism, which is a term coined by whites to make anybody who is not white, who is not Christian, be declared as other, Oriental or other, different, not belonging, and therefore threatening. And that operates in ways that perpetuate us being in a state of war all the time against forces that other certain groups of people and therefore pose a threat. So what is structural racism? It's not about biology. It is not just about racial slurs, and it is definitely not about bad or good intentions. What it is structural and institutionalized, as we've just talked about. It's culturally embedded, and it is internalized in us through stereotype and our implicit bias, which is subconscious. One way to think about this is if we could take every overt racist, Ku Klux Klan, white supremacist, and put them on spaceships and send them to Mars, we would still have structural racism embedded in our society, in our laws, in our culture, and so forth. And here are some examples. So we all know about racial covenants and redlining and practices that historically have excluded certain groups of people. So 2 examples here from Spokane and Bellingham are language that says, for example, no race or nationality other than the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race or nationality employed by an owner or a tenant. Now, in Spokane, there are dozens of these racial covenants still on the books. Of course, they're not enforced, and nor could they be, but they're still traveling with us in time to the present day. And this is true all across our state and all across our nation. What is racial bias? So we know that lingering from the genocidal history and the chattel slavery history of the United States, that the children from these communities are removed from their families at greater rates than other races, and they stay in foster care longer. Their time in foster care is traumatic. It often involves abuse, neglect, and certainly the severing of their ties from their communities of origin. So this is more of the legacy of over 400 years engaging with us today and having to be tackled today. So where does implicit bias come from? Many of you know about this. You have taken some of the IATs. The IAT stands for Implicit Associations Test. The Implicit Associations Test was pioneered by a University of Washington professor named Anthony Greenwald, who's still there. But this is decades ago that he did this. And the IAT tests, which have now been taken by millions of people, looks at, you can take tests about implicit bias on any number of issues or characteristics. For example, race, gender, people with disabilities, people who are left-handed, body image, and so forth. And so if you have not yet done it, or even if you have but not for some time, you could take a refresher, and you can find them at Project Implicit, which is administered by Harvard University. It measures the ease with which people associate words or pictures representing either of two contrasting groups. We all have it. We all have bias because we live in a world that carries with it structures, as we've talked about, that racialize or other certain groups of people. And the more aware we are of our bias, the stronger we can become at doing something about that bias. The worst outcome we could possibly have of implicit associations testing is for people to throw their hands up and say, well, I'm biased, but so is everybody else. Everybody's biased. So, what can we do about it? That is not the goal. The goal is for us to recognize and understand that we, along with everybody else, do have biases, but that those biases interfere with our ability to recognize the humanity of everybody, to recognize the inhumanity of allowing our implicit biases to go unchecked. Why is this work so challenging? So this slide shows you the different levels at which race equity work has to go on simultaneously. So it's like playing 5-level chess, 5-dimension chess. It's hard to hold all of these in our hand at once, and it takes a lot of effort and practice to do it. So understanding that we have to tackle in an affirmative way our biases at an individual way and become race equity competent as an individual, that does not relieve us of the responsibility of understanding how we act in the world, either as a white person or a BIPOC person, in ways with other people. So that's the interpersonal level, that either reinforce equity or do harm because we do not understand how our behavior is affecting somebody else. And then moving to the third circle towards the left, the organizational level. Organizations have race equity competency profiles just the same as individual humans do. And so to what extent is your organization or an organization with which you're working able to understand implicit bias, the implications of implicit bias in how the organization operates, how it treats its people, how it treats its clients, and so forth. And then the next level, community, is about the extent to which we align ourselves and our efforts at all levels to be pro-equity and anti-racist by being accountable to and guided by those communities most harmed by structural oppression, structural racism, who know best what must change, but who are often furthest from power to do anything about making the change come to pass. And that's where many of us come in as advocates to serve side by side, shoulder to shoulder with those community efforts and leverage our privilege and our knowledge in the service of anti-racist work. And then finally, the outermost level on the left is structural. So checking in with and holding ourselves accountable to the extent to which the work that we're doing is aligning with social justice movements like Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too, and so forth. So let's talk about implicit bias a little bit more. This is the brain science slide. And what's important to understand is that our actions, our attitudes, and the stereotypes that we carry forward from society, they do affect our actions and our decisions, but at an unconscious level. And these are all activated without us being aware of it often, and we don't have intentional control over our reactions. So our reactions are just what they are. The issue isn't whether we have them, we do, but rather how we come to understand and transcend them in order to interrupt racism. So this shows the brain, and the first system is the unconscious, automatic, fast, and effortless system. It governs your digestion, your ability to maintain balance while you walk, and so forth, your digestion, your heartbeat, your body temperature, and regulation of your body temperature. So understanding the human brain, so that this unconscious system can activate 11 million bits per second in order to govern all of this action, blinking, digestion, everything. System 2, which is the latest developing part of your brain, in the front part of your brain, also known as the prefrontal cortex or the executive brain, that can only process 40 bits per second. So when a threat comes up or a difficulty comes up, which do you think is going to win? 11 million bits a second system or 40 bits a second system? So the executive functioning brain is never going to win. It's 100% going to be the unconscious system that wins out as the response that gets activated when something happens. That is something we cannot change. What we can change is how we understand our reactions, how we understand the ways in which we could respond, which again takes a lot of practice. So how do we react before we even realize it? This would all be at the unconscious or subconscious level. First, we sort things into categories. Then we create associations between things. and then we fill in gaps when we only receive partial information. So if I show a very crude drawing of an animal that's pink and has a curly tail, you don't need a whole course to know that I'm trying to show you a pig, and so forth. So these are things we learn in our infancy and our childhood, and all of us have them, that we fill in the gaps by association. This slide is meant to show you that all of us are swimming in this ocean or sea of toxic, racist water. And so this devalues certain people and uplifts other people. And this is just the default status quo that we all live in, whether we're white or BIPOC people. One thing that's become popular to talk about these days is the concept of white fragility. Robin DiAngelo has written the book White Fragility, and she talks about the ways in which most white people consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to their identities as good and moral people. And so we at Just Lead call the threat that white people who are out of practice about confronting the legacies of racism, chattel slavery, genocide, and so forth, we call these the Ds, the D words. So there's defensiveness, there's denial, there's deflection, there's distraction. There's a whole range of responses that really close the space to understanding, because all the energy is being taken away by deflection and defensiveness. There's good writing about this, and I urge you to, if you're a white person, to dive into that. Okay, we already talked about how our ideas, our schemas, the ways of looking at the world are embedded in us from our parents, our friends, the media, and they're strengthened over time. We know, for example, in the last 4 to 5 years, the idea that people are in echo chambers, that they choose things that reinforce their own way of thinking about the world, and that makes them less open, all of us less open to viewing the world from different perspectives. It's comforting, but it is not enlightening in ways that allow us to understand each other. So, although our mind operates at the two levels of the conscious level, prefrontal cortex, that we talked about, 40 bits a second, and the unconscious level, 11 million bits, what we also know is that we consciously reject stereotypes. So our executive function has learned, like, this is racist. I am not a racist, therefore I don't think this way. But that doesn't avoid the default culture having us make assumptions at the unconscious level, which result in our behaviors at times being racist. And an important thing at the bottom of this slide is what we're going for here is not people's good intentions, but rather the impact of their actions. Some of you may have heard of microaggressions, a term coined by Dr. Pierce in the 1970s. So you don't have to have the KKK burning a cross on your front lawn. You don't have to have physical assaults. Microaggressions are the everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons. And these are based only on the person's membership in a marginalized group. So, for example, as an Asian American woman of Chinese parents, I have been asked throughout my whole life the question, where were you born? And I say, Washington, D.C. And the next question is always, no, where were you really born? Meaning you couldn't really have been born in Washington, D.C. because, you look like you don't belong here. And I say, Washington, D.C., would you like to see my birth certificate? Once the questioner figures out that maybe I was born in Washington, D.C. by some fluke, they then revert to or turn to, well, then where are your people from? Yet another way of saying you don't belong here. It may be that you were born in Washington, D.C., but you and your people don't belong here. And another microaggression is veiled or masquerading as a compliment. And that is when people say, gosh, Ada, your English is so good. Where did you learn such good English? Like, a person who looks like me cannot possibly have good English. And then the last capper to this is, your parents must be so proud of you. Translation, your non-belonging other parents' expectations of you, which had to be low, have been exceeded because you have good English. And every BIPOC person has their version of these micro assaults, insults. Can I touch your hair? Do you really eat eels? Whatever those derogatory comments that are racially based. Okay, what do we do about all of this? Implicit bias, the 5 levels, how difficult this is. And so this is a framework that is helpful in deciphering social rank. So in this picture on the right, imagine this is a TV screen. And on that TV screen, there are 9 channels. The channels represent age, disability, religious culture, ethnicity and race, sexual orientation, social class culture, indigenous membership or heritage, national origin, and gender identity. And so we're going to reflect on our own lived experience of privilege and marginalization. So here's a worksheet, and please just take a moment to fill it in. It's called a duality, meaning you have to be either an agent or a target. You can't be some other thing like a Martian and get off the page. You're either an agent or a target in those 9 categories or 9 channels playing on that station. Age, disability, religion, ethnicity and race, social class, culture, sexual orientation, indigenous group heritage, national origin, and gender identity. So take a moment to fill this in, either for yourself or for somebody else if you like. Some of you already done this number of times. And it has to be somebody you really know well enough to be able to say, are they an agent or are they a target in these categories? So I'll just give you a moment right now to fill this in. Okay, so by now you've had a chance to fill this in terms of your social rank categories as agents or targets. And this framework can be an entire PhD level course. So I am just introducing you to the framework. You can read the book and articles that we list for you at the end, link to. But for the purposes of just giving you a sense of what this framework is about, the next slide shows you that in any category in which you're an agent, and there may be people who have no agent skills categories, but most people do. Certainly people who are participating in this probably at least have agency in the social class culture, having the privilege of education, access to Zoom, and all of this. So thinking about where you are an agent, and you're looking at people who are targets, there are a series of skills, and this is holarchical, meaning these are not a sequence. You don't move from indifference to distancing and marching across to the right side. These are skill sets which you return to, you loop around, and you move back and forth between and among these skill sets based on the situation and the amount of work you've put into trying to grow. So these categories, although we don't have time in this session to go into each of these, what I will say that is that as an agent, as you move across that double line between inclusion and awareness, that your role as an agent who has power, privilege, is to, one, be always aware of the fact and have humility about the fact that you cannot and do not understand the lived experience of BIPOC, let's say in the category of race, and that it's up to you to learn, educate yourself, but never to do that at the expense of BIPOC, like burdening those people who are targets with the weight of your education. So there's so many ways that you can educate yourself. And also if you want to inquire and get help in understanding something from somebody who is a target, you can ask for permission to ask them questions and help to educate you. They can say no, or they can decide this is an important relationship and they want to invest in it and they have the bandwidth to do it. But honestly, BIPOC are so exhausted and they do not want to be the primary carriers of education for white people. It's just too much. And then moving towards allyship, where you have privilege and power and um, disproportionate access to resources over, for example, BIPOC people in the category of ethnicity and race, that your role is to insist that resources be devoted to creating what we call affinity space or caucus space for BIPOC in the case of race, where BIPOC can meet and share their experiences and ideas. And they can do this in an environment which we call brave space, where they're free from the continuous white gaze. So the companion piece to this is the target skill sets. And so again, this is not a staged spectrum where you move from the left to the right. These are just different skill sets that we bounce around in loops from time to time, depending on the situation. But for the targets, let's just use race again as an example, because that's what we're talking about today. The key for targets is to, in the strategy space, to recognize that when somebody does or says something that's racist or microaggressive, that they may not have done that, taken that action out of hostility or animus. They may just be ignorant. Most obviously in multi-generational situations. Using a gender experience, I once gently confronted a judge when I was having a conversation and he kept referring to his support staff person as his girl, and I knew that his support staff person, a woman, was well into her 60s, and I pointed out that maybe he would not call her a girl. And that didn't end well, but ultimately that judge did apologize to his assistant and also thanked me for calling that to his attention. Um, and so um, recognizing that as targets, if we have the energy and the bandwidth to try and engage somebody who's an agent and educate them, then great. However, it's up to us to choose. We may be exhausted and not have the bandwidth or the interest in investing in that particular person. And that's completely up to us as BIPOC. And then the second thing is to relentlessly pursue affinity space. So BIPOC brave space free from the continuous white gaze in order to oxygenate from living 24/7 in a toxic racist environment and society and culture. So that is the quick tour around target agent skills. This is the book from which it is derived, Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment by Dr. Leticia Nieto. I recommend it. When Justice Barbara Madsen was the Chief Justice, she purchased a copy of this book for every staff person at the administrator of the court's office. And for a year, they would have brown bag lunch sessions and discuss chapter by chapter till they got through the book. So that's an example of community alignment learning. Okay, what can we do about our implicit biases and how we know our brains operate in spite of our own best conscious intentions, the 40 bits a second part of us, always fighting up against 11 million bits of unconscious capacity. So this is something called the ladder of inference. It's also been called the ladder of assumptions. And the old joke is to assume makes an ass of you and me, if you break down the word assume. And so the ladder shows you how the higher up you go by making assumptions, the tougher the fall coming down. And so there's a good story about this that I heard when I went to a session by Stephen Covey, who's like a cottage industry of books on 7 practices for leaders. And he talks about how he did a 2-day session for thousands of people at Madison Square Garden in New York City years ago on the 7 practices. And he was exhausted. He's a one-man show, so he's up there on the stage for 7 hours, and it's just him and thousands of people in the audience. And he was headed home for the weekend, very, very excited to have some downtime and a rest. and he took the Long Island Railroad to go back to his home. And while he was sitting in the railroad, exhausted and completely played out, there was a man with two children in the railway car. The man was wearing a jumpsuit like that you would wear in an auto mechanic shop, with his name chain stitch embroidered across his pocket that said Juan. And the two little boys were running wild around the car, knocked over Stephen Covey's briefcase, stepped on people's toes, screaming, running around. And Stephen Covey immediately goes right up the ladder. It's like, these children are out of control. So he sees all of this. And this father is doing nothing. He's just sitting there. Then step 3, this is terrible parenting. Step 4, these people don't know how to parent. This is a culture that doesn't understand mainstream American child discipline and appropriate behavior and so forth. And so he's all the way up the ladder about these people. And he looks over and he's about to say something curt and impatient to this father. And he realizes the father's weeping, and his face is in his hands and his shoulders are heaving. And he says, Stephen Covey says, sir, what is wrong? And the man says, I don't know how to tell my children that their mother has just passed away. So in that instance, the whole ladder falls down. Stephen Covey puts his arm around the man and says, I get off on the next stop. I have a car in the parking lot. I can take you and your boys wherever you want to go. How can I help you? So that's just a great example. And all of us, to some lesser degree, usually have gone up the ladder and, had to eat our humble pie, recognizing that we have gone up the ladder in ways that really were not correct. And when we do this, it's a big problem. So when you see yourself going up the ladder, stop. And even you can observe and then recognize that you may not know what is going on. So the other short example I'll give you is that if my husband and I are driving and someone cuts us off, like really cuts us off in a very unsafe manner, my spouse's response, I can't repeat, the words, because they're mostly expletives about what a terrible driver and so on and so forth. Whereas I have trained myself to create an alternative narrative. So my narrative might be, his wife is in labor, she's about to give birth, he's rushing to the hospital, and he's not thinking that well about being a safe driver. He's mostly dealing with a panic emergency. And of course, this explanation that I give drives my husband absolutely bonkers. But it's so much less toxic to me than becoming angry at that person. It's just not worth it to me. Nothing I can do about it anyway. And so that's an example, a cheap, easy way to just get off the ladder and make up an alternate story to the one that you're sort of moving up the ladder into. All right, what can we do? So my colleagues at Just Lead have created this next set of slides. So number 1 is insist to ourselves that we keep on remembering and having the humility to remember that we all have cultural experiences, backgrounds. We all make assumptions and have biases based on our unique lived experience. So just understanding that your experience is not mine, and everybody has their own unique experiences. So that's step 1. And given that, that there are going to be differences in the way people operate, because because of that different lived experience. And so what do we do about it? The green square at the top is what we do about it. We pause. Speed and intensity cause us to run up the ladder fast. Pausing, slowing down, and reflecting allows us to exit the ladder and instead cultivate understanding. And interrupting the unconscious or subconscious immediate associations that lead us to use stereotypes instead of humanity and living and engaging in right relationship with others. So to understand this, it's helpful to know that we all face something called racial anxiety and stereotype threat. So the white man who's like closing his ears is an image of a person experiencing racial anxiety. So let's just assume the R word, race, has come up in the context of his work, and he has white fragility as a response. Like, I didn't own slaves, I'm colorblind, I've spent my whole life working for social justice, and I've represented homeless people and migrant farm workers, and I can't believe that anybody would ever think that I would be or do anything racist. So this person is in psychic distress. He doesn't want to be perceived as the stereotype of a white male who's racist. And so he's in a lot of pain. And at the bottom is a young person who's BIPOC. And she is distressed because she's in a situation which has activated her fear that she will be perceived as all the stereotypes that BIPOC have to face. That not good at science, not good at math, intellectually not up to snuff, emotionally carrying different responses than dominant white culture, upper middle class responses. And so this is causing this person a tremendous amount of distress that she will be perceived as the stereotypes that people impose on BIPOC. And in her case, BIPOC women. And so this is hugely interfering with people's ability to engage in the conversation, let alone change behavior. How do we respond when we're under psychic distress because of this anxiety we have, stereotype threat and racial anxiety? So these are core embodied coping strategies. And by core embodied, we mean unconscious, subconscious, not executive function. This is not us operating at our highest and best selves. This is us reacting and responding without thought. It's automatic. And coping is not a state we want to be in for very long. Coping is just surviving. It is not something that brings us to better levels of understanding and better levels of acting. But to understand what these behaviors are is very, very helpful because we've all engaged in them and we've all observed people engaging in them. So we know, everybody knows about fight or flight. There's a threat. Somebody has just dissed my little sister and I want to punch them in the nose. The person stands up, they're 6'4" and they weigh 300 pounds. Okay, maybe my sister and I are running away at that point. Think the better of it and not fight, but run away because the threat is bigger than we can deal with. In especially professional settings or high stakes settings, when we feel threatened because the R word has come up in the conversation, race, we might commonly freeze. By freeze, we are deer in the headlights, and to the extent we can think, what we're probably thinking is, I don't know what to do. Anything I do can make it worse. I have no idea what to do to make it better. Therefore, I can't do anything. I'm frozen. Pretty much everybody has experienced this. Appease. So especially for people in agent categories, appeasing is like, oh my God, that person just said a racist thing. Um, my colleagues of color have just listened to that. I will run in and fix it. I will run in and tackle it for them. And while that in certain situations might be very helpful, it takes away the agency, small a, of the BIPOC. You know, they might want to respond in themselves or respond in a different way than having you run over and say, I will fix this. And then finally, disassociate. So when things get too hot in terms of threat, say you're in a courtroom, the judge is sitting there, something racist happens, you're not in charge, you don't know what to do, um, you just sort of bow out. You cannot leave, but you just don't want to get involved. So you exit the premises mentally and you start thinking about something unrelated, like, what was on the shopping list for dinner tonight? I think I'll have to stop off at Trader Joe's and get this and that and the other thing. So your body is present, your mind has left the premises. And so that's sometimes how we cope as well. So these are not high level functions, but recognizing that all of us do this is very helpful, because when you recognize it, then you can overcome it. If you're in it and you cannot recognize you're in it, then you cannot overcome it. This is a handy little phrase or acronym that is the steps that you can take if you recognize that in spite of your good intentions, you have done or said something that has done harm. Or the minute it came out of your mouth or you took the action, you regretted it. And you thought, ugh, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Oh my goodness, I totally didn't get that there's a person in my class with disabilities and that I may have activated their trauma by doing this. And oh, I can't believe I did that. So the milk has been spilled. You cannot unspill the milk. Then what do you do? So if somebody names what you've done, called you out on it, center yourself. You are not being attacked. It's not about being a good or bad person. This is about your behavior and trying to not do it again, trying to learn. The second is to listen, to actively listen. And that means listening to understand and not listening to respond or react. So do not interrupt or think of ways to defend yourself. Focus instead on learning what you did, how it was harmful, and trying to achieve a level of empathy and compassion to the person who is expressing harm or who you realize yourself you may have harmed. The third thing is to acknowledge the harm and to apologize. Not a politician's apology, like, if I have something I have done or said has hurt somebody, I don't know who or why, in some way, then I apologize. That's a half-assed non-apology. This is not what we mean. So we acknowledge. We don't explain why we did it. We don't try to self-justify. We acknowledge what we did, and we say we're sorry. The next thing is to inquire. So inquiring means getting permission to ask the person what you could do next time instead of what you did. Sometimes you already know that. And asking how you can make amends for what happened. The person that has been harmed may not want to have anything to do with you, and you have to accept that. But they may have suggestions, especially if they're in a actual relationship, employment or otherwise with you, and want things to get better. So then they could help articulate what you could do differently next time. That would be a blessing. And then finally, the best apology is changed behavior. So if anybody suggested ways you could change and do better, do it and try to avoid doing the harm again. And then expand upon your experience to help others learn too. Moving along in how we can make things better. This slide shows you, it's from Race Forward, a wonderful organization, great resources there. From our status quo, which is implicit bias, very powerful as we know, we're unaware that we are making certain decisions because they're all default decisions. They're status quo, it's the system rolling forward. How do we counter that? On the right side, we have explicit equity-based changes. So, for example, when the court adopted GR 37 on jury selection, they were trying to deal with the fact that the default system allowed a person of color to be asked 10 times the number of questions as the white people during jury selection in a case. And so GR 37 started to build in some gauntlets or hurdles that you had to overcome to demonstrate that race was not involved in the process. So you shift the burden to equity being explicit and away from just relying on default systemic approaches that just exist, that everybody just accepts without challenge. The second thing in this is that the status quo is, especially in law and justice and healthcare and other institutions and industries as well, makes decisions without any input in a meaningful way and in a timely way from the communities most harmed and most affected by the decisions that are about to be made. And what we need to do is move to an explicit equity-based approach that fosters active engagement, partnership, and accountability to the communities most harmed by structural racism, for example, who know best what really needs to change, and yet who are furthest from power often to do anything about the status quo, which is harming them, which is where we come in as law and justice committed people. The third is ignoring that there are barriers to access. So when I was leading a legal services organization, one of the cases we had to bring was against a county that had made a decision not to purchase what they call kneeling buses, the buses that go down in the front so that a person in a wheelchair could have access to public transportation. And their excuse was that the Americans with Disabilities Act related requirement that they upgrade equipment and public transit wasn't going to take effect for yet another 3 weeks. Therefore, they could get away with not purchasing the kneeling buses. Well, of course, they lost that case. But the image that I remember is that the half a dozen clients that we represented, who were all in wheelchairs, actually couldn't get into the courtroom because the doorway and the aisle down the center of the courthouse were too narrow for their wheelchairs. So they just like had to fan out behind the door and kind of, you know, push their ears to the open space and try to listen to what was going on in their case. And so that imagery has always stuck with me as like, what are we not getting about how these decisions are affecting people who do not have access? And how do we remove those barriers? And so forth. So these slides you'll have access to. Okay, we're going to move on to anti-indigeneity, which is the personal, legal, social, political, in other words, all these structures attack on indigenous people, and the attacks are to dehumanize them through making them invisible, certainly through genocidal practices, through the forcing of their children into assimilation schools, in which they were abused, and we're seeing every day now horrific um, uncoverings of mass grave sites of Indian children being unearthed in Canada and also in the United States. This legacy of horror and genocide. And also through environmental, health, education, safety, and other forms of and systems that exercise discrimination and violence against Indigenous people. So how do we make Indigenous people and their history and their cultures invisible? So we know the policies that I described earlier, that they are made invisible. They were literally disappeared. And those that survived were pressed into forced assimilation. And we see today the resilience and the resistance of Native American indigenous communities to their oppression. It's magnificent community overcoming centuries of multi-generational oppression. This is an example of a class book, a course book, in which the story is told from the perspective of the colonizers, meaning the white European settlers who came and drove out Native Americans or indigenous people. So it has this description called moving out. When the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations peoples agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. I'm speechless, but this is what for generations Americans have been taught, that Native Americans agreed to move to make room for the new settlements, as if violence and genocide and the taking of their children, their culture, their religious artifacts was not involved. So here's the lie. We know that there's the use of caricatures to dehumanize, exploit, and devalue indigenous people, but also to monetize through caricature and exoticization, and to somehow diminish the white responsibility for what has happened to indigenous people. So these are some examples you might recognize. Washington Redskins, which now nobody uses that. They're now called the Washington Nationals because of protest movements. The tomahawk chop, which has been discontinued. all these ways that indigenous people have been made into cartoons and stereotypes, which are not favorable to them, do not humanize them, but are used to monetize the owners of these sports teams' profit. There's a tremendous amount of data about the health outcomes and violence continuing against indigenous people. So racist policies and health outcomes, education outcomes, economic outcomes, and environmental outcomes. And most recently, the CDC, I'm reading from a magazine here that said, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data shows the percentage of indigenous people who have received vaccination lags far behind the percentage of those eligible and of non-Hispanic whites. And its hospitalization rates compared to whites for COVID, American Indian, 3.5 times more hospitalizations. That's the highest rate of any group. Latinx 3 times and Black 3 times. But so 3.5 times for Native American. COVID-19 death rates compared to whites. For American Indians, 2.4 times as whites. Percentage of those who got at least one dose of the COVID vaccine, American Indians, 1%. Whites, 63%. Okay, this is from the June issue. So this is the history of oppression, and it doesn't die off with one generation. Sociologists say that 12 generations ahead are affected by oppression and dehumanization of any group. So here we are 12 generations later, facing the same kinds of tragedy and disparate treatment. These sexual violence statistics are horrible. We know that nationally, indigenous women are 9 times as likely as white women to be subjected to sexual violence, murder, rape, and sex trafficking. Okay, what do we do about this? How do we decolonize our institutions, which this is a big task because, as we know, it's been multi-century and multi-generationally harmful, toxic to indigenous communities. And so this slide shows how we want to move from the traditional on the left side, which is the status quo, which was colonization, settlers, quote, getting indigenous people to move to make room for them. It's extraction based, so we take away their land and then we get to use the land. We appropriate their culture. Oh, look, I have dream catchers in my window. I have traveled to Native American reservations. I have purchased Indian products. The most famous of all was the Pendleton Company having appropriated Indian design and then having to pay reparations for that in the course of a lawsuit. And traditional culture is individualistic, whereas indigenous culture is community and relationship based. So you can see on the right side, decolonization practices involve returning artifacts to Native American communities, having authentic relationships with Native American communities, restoring their property, the land back movement, for example. Almost half the state of Oklahoma is going back to a half a dozen tribes because of treaty violations, and being in right relationship with indigenous communities. So we're at the end now, and this is a resource slide you can reference at your leisure. We have at Just Lead a Race, Equity, and Justice Initiative Toolkit. We call it REGI for short, Race, Equity, and Justice Initiative. And you can download the entire toolkit, which is in its 2.0 version. It's always undergoing improvement, so if you have suggestions and ideas, please send them to us. And you can reach us at justleadwa.org. And then you can see that there's 5 areas we focus in the toolkit on: organizations and race equity work in the context of organizational life. There are 5 primary areas. What's the degree of leadership commitment to pro-equity, anti-racist work? How equitable is the organizational culture, from the staff to the board to the management to volunteers and partners? How do the recruitment, hiring, and retention policies operate in ways that are pro-equity and anti-racist? What accountability to and partners with communities of color most harmed by racism look like for the organization? And finally, how is the organization run using an anti-racism analysis for all decision-making, policies, procedures, and practices? With that, I would like to thank you so much for your attention. Here are our websites if you want to learn more about Just Lead and the Race, Equity, and Justice Initiative. Please send feedback. We'd love to hear it. And if you have questions that you would like more resources to answer, just let us know. So with that, I will say goodbye, and thanks for your attention.